Is this okay? Can we start?
You can.
Lovely. Okay. My name is Lora Nicolaou. As I said before, I always want to know where the information comes from. So I'll explain a little bit. I was trained as an architect originally and practiced in the UK for about 25 years. After 10 years, I gave that up and moved into kind of large-scale design, into master planning, and later on into what I call strategic briefing. So lots of the projects I'll be showing you today come from that era. I've been back for about 10 years and I'm teaching in the School of Architecture, third-year studio, like your age. And I deliver 2 courses, Introduction to Urbanism, which is actually master planning, and then Introduction to Landscape Architecture. So that's where the information comes from. What I want to do quickly is explain a little bit. It's a huge topic for 30 minutes, but we're going to do our best to sort of explain the kind of basics. So other than what is a master plan, I would like to refer here and there to how it is produced and where are the pitfalls, where are the difficulties in the production of master plans, and also what are the preconditions of success. Master plan is a very early stage drawing or plan which is not necessarily delivered. So the reason why it's not or not is very significant in terms of how you design it, the impact on the delivery, and what are the preconditions for the success. We're talking here about spatial master plans. You know, the term master plan is used in all sorts of contexts. It refers to all sorts of things, but here we're talking about the spatial master plan. In very, very simple terms, if you want a definition, it's a development framework. It's actually a description of what will happen in the future, which regulates in some ways change in an organized manner. Change happens all the time. Everything changes continuously. What the master plan does, it gives an overall framework for that change to take place. Keep in mind that the plan we see and we call master plans are only a fraction, a very, very small part of what we would suggest a master planning process is. So we see an image, but that image has behind it a huge amount of information which is recorded in a number of different ways and is published also in different ways. Is published in the master planning report, but in a number of other documents and so on. So what it is an abstraction of reality, like the architectural drawings in abstraction. They're not realities. It's a vision of what I would call latent potential. Latent potential is something which sits there sleeping, waiting to be awakened. Okay, so there's all sides have this latent potential, something vital in other words, that is sitting there unused, and the master plan comes in order to surface that hidden value. And it's a regulatory framework, as I said before. It's a regulatory framework. And it organizes complexities. There is complexity in architectural design, as you know, but when you're designing at a larger scale, the complexities are bigger, wider, and so on and so forth. In very, very simple terms, a master plan, a plan in other words, what does it do? It organizes the streets, the network. In other words, it sets up the structure of a new place, either on an empty site or an infill site and so on. It defines the massing and the height of the buildings. So it actually defines and decides what we call morphology of the area. It controls the relationship between buildings and outdoor space. So it defines the network of public spaces. It defines uses. It says here housing, there commercial, and further on offices and so on. So not just uses, but the activities. So here we're going to play, and there we're going to eat, and there we're going to go for a walk in the park and so on. It defines the infrastructure, a very important thing, which is actually the movement patterns, and also the utilities, which usually follow the movement, the infrastructure. So it's what it's under the streets, which are the utility base. And also finally, the natural environment. It talks a lot about green space and how we integrate the natural environment into places. Now, so in actual terms, what it does, it sketches the outline of the character of what we call place in very simple terms. Now, I'm not going to use the term sustainability in the whole presentation, because sustainability is an attitude, as you know, It's something, it's an attitude, it's an ideology, it's the way you work. So sustainability sits in all of these parameters. You can actually design a morphology in sustainable ways in respecting sunlight access into the ground floor of buildings, and the use that mixes tenures and so on and so forth. So in every single one of them, the sustainability aspects relates to each of these parameters. Now, what kind of types are there? And I think there are two parameters which actually differentiate. There are lots of types of master plans, and I brought a few in order to discuss. The one is the scale. Okay, there are very large scale master plans, almost sometimes at the scale of a region. And there are small master plans at the scale of 3, 4 buildings, 5 buildings, or whatever, very, very small. So that's something which differentiates the nature of the master plan if you want to. And then we've got the client, how far the master plan comes from, is commissioned by the private sector, a developer, or how far is commissioned by public sector. So the developer is interested in building commercial accommodation and selling it, while the public sector is interested in regulating conditions in the urban setting. Look at them a little bit closer. Now, in terms of the scale, these very large master plans are conceptual. In other words, the further away you are from the delivery of the plan, and if you're at a very large scale, you're away from the delivery, the ideas are more conceptual than actual or real. While a small scale, I would call it an implementation or a delivery plan. And please keep in mind that when you see a master plan, this is not what is going to sit on the ground. I worked on Cherrywood, the master plan to the left, in 1998. And I went in 2010, and there were another 3 versions of that master plan, designed by different master planners, and also architects at the very end that were start designing the neighborhoods before they actually delivered the project. So the master plan is just one stop in a very long process which a large site needs in order to develop. For example, an example here, I don't know if you know London at all, there is one of the latest very large developments in London is Battersea Power Station. You can see it on the left in a very central location in London, but a huge industrial site which was discommissioned in the late 70s. The conversation about the fit out of that place and its master plan, it started in 1983. Actually, late 80s, I was involved in writing a brief for it. And the first houses were delivered in 2021. That makes what? It makes 40 years. It makes 40 years for a master plan to mature and actually become a place. Now, in Battersea, if you look at the master plan here to the left, what is delivered now is what is in the yellow line. And I would say the remaining of that master plan, it has another 50, 70 years. In other words, we're talking about a plan which might take a century. If the market conditions are not favorable and developers cannot build fast enough, it can take up to 100 years to mature if you want it to be delivered in full. So building in flexibility in these plans is absolutely essential. So if the market now is housing, and then in the next decade the market is going to be offices, and then the next decade is going to be luxury houses, and the next decade is going to be affordable housing, all of those things need to be, there must be a room in the master plan to be actually accommodated. Now, looking at the private and the public sector, the interesting strategy master plans, the most interesting ones I've done is what I would call regeneration master plans. There are master plans which are not dealing only with their tenants, but they are taking up a piece of city and they're trying to rejuvenate it. There is always new development in, because that generates the value in order to pay for all the stuff you want to do in parks, in public spaces, and so forth. So this regeneration strategies is the interest of the public sector and also statutory plans. In other words, some of those master plans, they become law. Okay, so I've worked on the master plan of the central area of Nicosia, which became an area plan. In other words, it went through certain procedures, it became law, and actually that supersedes what we call the local plan of Nicosia, which is a very generous strategic plan. So master plans can become statutory, in other words, they can become law and they can be enforced. Now, it's not fair to say that developers don't do regeneration work. It's not true. For example, there are large projects in London like King's Cross and a lot of work that Argent did. Argent is a local developer and did a fantastic regeneration plan. And also Igloo Regeneration, they were specifically set up in order to tackle difficult sites in existing areas, declined areas, in order to focus on this aspect of regeneration. So a master plan is not about improving the physical setting. And although we're not economists and we can't do much about it, we need to understand that the master plan generates triggers economic shifts. And we need to understand those in order to be able to complete the master plan in a way that it can. Because if we make it wrong, then it won't. It also restructures social and cultural context. We'll talk a little bit about gentrification. For example, if you create in a low value area, very, very high value accommodation, like very luxury flats, what you're going to do, you're going to force the old tenants to move out. So you're changing what we call the social mix in that area. There isn't much we can do as master planners to stop it, but we need to understand it. We need to understand it, to be aware of it, and then use tricks in order to keep some balances. And of course, every master plan, when it's delivered, it needs to be able to self-sustain itself like any part of town. For example, the center of Rome, it has gone through hundreds of iterations, but it does it on its own. In other words, in a peaceful way, it manages and this has to do with the flexibility, I think. So each new master plan needs to be able to do that. Now, this is what I was saying. So the master plan itself, this is Battersea Park again, the plan within the green line. Look what happened around it before construction started. Everybody rushed in to buy flats in the surrounding areas. All the pubs, they became bistros and lovely places to sit and eat. And the social base of the surrounding area, and an area which is as large as the one you can see on the image to the right, for example, the master plan is this, all of that was designated as what we call the regeneration area. So the master plan has an impact beyond its boundary, and it always holds this danger of gentrification. In other words, of pushing out the existing tenants and bringing new ones. In my view, there is nothing wrong with it. For example, the Cypriot community in London, they were based in Camden Town, I don't know if you know London much. In the 70s, they sold that for fortunes and they moved to Wood Green. That area, which was very downgraded, became very trendy. 20 years later, 30 years, they sold there and they moved up north. So actually, a lot of the Cypriot community made huge amounts of money and they set up businesses and they educated their children by using gentrification as a way of creating wealth for themselves. The problem are the very low income people, that they are left with very high rents and nowhere to go. So gentrification has some dangers that we need to be aware of it. Very quickly, I'll go through, let me know 10 minutes or 5 minutes before we finish. Strategic master plans, we start from the very top scale. I'm not sure if you've heard of Emscher Park. Emscher Park, it was a region in Germany, the Ruhr region, that it was totally discommissioned in the late 70s because it was packed with the steel industry. Suddenly the steel industry came to a hold. There was absolutely nothing else to hold this together. A huge initiative, I think, 4 municipalities, 800 square kilometers, huge amount of central government money in order to draw this master plan, what I call, and it is based on 2 assets the area had. They had 2 assets. The one was the green space, in other words, the landscape. It was a fantastic, beautiful, mature landscape. And the second were the bits of industrial archaeology. They used both of them in order to shift the area around in 20 years. Now, this happened in Germany for a simple reason, I think. The local municipalities have the ability to put taxes and raise money, raise funds, in order to put into those kind of large projects. In the UK, this could not have been done because the local authorities, they don't have that kind of money to create those kind of national initiatives. Now, when it comes to statutory plans, lots of cities now, and here in Lisbon, they're actually drawing into a plan aspects of their regulatory plans. In this particular case is green. So they define, they extend, they enhance, they statutory safeguard their green framework, which is parks, lanes, water, and so on and so forth. This is what I worked on. This is the expansion of Cambridge, and I worked on it in 2002. And what Cambridge wanted desperately for an expansion, but it was enclosed by a huge amount of very, very sensitive areas, beautiful landscapes, and also conservation villages. So they asked the $1 million question, in which way shall we expand? And we ran an assessment to start with, which it was on landscape character, infrastructure capacity, neighboring areas and what their value was, and also the capacity of potential locations, in order to suggest that, which is shown to the image of the right, that the yellow areas, north, south, and west, were not appropriate for expansion, where the area to the east was. And funnily enough, that holds the airport of Cambridge, which has been since decommissioned. And we follow that with what I call a very strategic large-scale master plan, which defines basically the location where you can build and the ones you cannot. It's just a simple landscape framework and defines the main routes through. And it also distributes the uses, because what it does, it actually respects the small little villages to the right and allows for their expansion, and generates that as a clip-on onto the building fabric of Cambridge, which is the whole grey area. So two very, very different things, two villages and an urban area. Despite the fact that we were not commissioned to design the roads or anything else, people are asking all the time, what does it look like? And how much space could we put in? So basically you start there by using empirical conceptual design tools and say, okay, this place can look like Barcelona, and that place can look like bits of Lisbon, and this place can look like the West End, and this like such and such a village or whatever. So on the basis of that, you can describe character, structure, mix of uses, housing typologies, and edge condition, which is very important in this particular case, and you write what I call the performance spec, performance specification. And on the basis of that, you can actually calculate capacity. Translating into populations, and therefore Cambridge can begin to build up its infrastructure towards the new 25,000 people, 30,000 people in this particular area. So that was the Cambridge Master Plan. Another one, which I think of this category is the last one, it's a plan we did in Dublin, okay? This side is called the Poolbeg Peninsula. That's why I put this picture here. When you arrive on the plane, the only thing you see is that peninsula with these two huge chimneys. The cultural significance of the site, it was scary. In other words, people that were actually gathering in the streets in order to ask not to develop the site and leave it as an industrial site derelict in the way it was left after the decommissioning of the industry. So a very, very sensitive site for Dublin. And we started by tracing the existing trails. Those 4 lines, they were actually trails, they were either footpaths within woodlands or lines, bits of railway lines, and we started recording the character of each of those in order to be able to translate them into a modern environment and make up a plan that actually carried through the essence of what it was on the side, using various components. So this is what you see in the middle scale. You see each of these lines fitted out with development with some references of the existing site. This is how it ended up with a public space network, with a network for recreation, green spaces, urban fields. In other words, through consultation, we found out that the urban fields, natural landscapes, they were very, very important. Of course, the network of the green. In the same way as before, everybody wanted to know what does that mean. So we picked up each component. You can see them in small diagrams here, and we describe them through images and references. So that became the base of future designs for each of the bits. Now, if we come down to scale, to neighborhood scale, this is a part of Poolbeg Peninsula. The previous project, suddenly 2 years later, we were commissioned in order to do the master plan. This is the urban field we retained in this particular location, and they wanted a housing project, which was again calculated in terms of its capacity. And again, theoretically, you always do the sketches in order to theoretically explain the character of the place. And it was actually delivered lately, is under construction. The second one for this category, and the last one, it's another project in Dublin, which is a mixed-use one. In other words, there are offices, a conference center, a concert hall, and housing. Now, the key about this kind of plans, for example, if we wouldn't draw it in color, you wouldn't be able to say it was there, or it wasn't there before. So, key aspect of lots of urban master plans is to integrate them into an existing context. And the best way, or the critical way of doing it, is by copying the scale. Now, there's a scale of the plan to begin to copy the surrounding area. This is what you see here. So basically, you copy the surrounding area, and then you can use landmarks, you can use places where they're different, but those are the non-thematic structures compared to the thematic structures with the rest of it. The developer got very greedy, and he asked us to design a second plan, which was rejected by the local authority because he wanted to go taller, bigger, more flats, and so on and so forth. Again, to point out again that as architect master planners, we always need to sort out things. For example, the density of this site was far greater than what the Dublin hold at the moment. So the question is, what kind of public realm will it have? How can you go to densities 4 times the size of the site? The city was 1.5 times the size of the site. Okay, so again, there are conversations about a double volume public realm, about using stocky short buildings that they didn't get out of the context, but they holded a lot of capacity. And we could even bring it into conceptual models like this one or even that one, in order to convince the local authority to go ahead with the project. Not to stress enough this issue of the impact of the architectural training in master planning. Here the developer in these ex-industrial areas, what you see at the back, these buildings were all mills, huge structures, okay? And he wanted here to build a building 3 times the height of those mills. And we got into this trouble, and we were not paid for it, in order to explain to him, you can have your square footage, but you don't need to go high. You are, I believe you're working now on a kind of tall building master plan, or a tall building. So the question is, why do you go tall? You can go short and fat with spaces which are much more useful. And we went into this exercise in order to convince the developer, and then we got actually the design of the building itself, because he liked the ideas. Master plans are not always on empty lands. This is one for the LSE, the London School of Economics in London, is reshuffling the accommodation of the university in the existing buildings. So we check every single building, the typology, what did it suit, and shuffle it around, make a structure plan which actually demolished some buildings in order to create public spaces, because the LSE doesn't have any public space of its own, and actually show them what it can look like by demolition of a very small building in this location. They could have actually a central square and the new building attached to it in order to continue with their estate strategy. Now, another 2 projects, those are student works, in order to talk a little bit about the master plan, which is large-scale architecture. This will concern you. It's a student looking into the floor plan of Nicosia. At the moment, there were no tall buildings nowhere to be found, okay? And he says, okay, if I wanted to place one as a landmark, where would it be? What you see at the very top is his planning framework, a set of planning criteria that he mapped, every single one of them, at the scale of the center of Nicosia and its surrounding areas, in order to identify a set of locations that they were appropriate for tall building. And he ended up choosing one of them, so there's a huge planning story behind it, which is the one opposite of where we're standing at the moment. We're here. And this is a site, which it's an extra, is the field, I think is the playing fields of this technology college. Okay? So Would you call that an architectural project or a landscape project or a master planning project? I would clearly call it a master planning project because the emphasis, it was on how we can bridge from the high end of where Apoel is and the big hotel, the landmark hotel, how we could cross into the park. So he created a series of layers of public space, fitted it out as a transport hub and a retail and all sorts of facilities relating to the university. In other words, he proposed that Kallipolios could expand into parts of it in order to bridge over and solve an urban problem. And this is what it looked like. Of course, he designed the building, but actually the emphasis was actually creating this public space for Nicosia, which could be connected east and west with the surrounding area. So I would call that a master plan more than a building design. This is one of his sections. Similarly, another student of mine, she took up a piece of Laleka waterfront, which is going to end up private housing developments, and she proposed a sports Disneyland, I could call that. And then she went into defining areas where this kind of sports facilities would sit, and she got into a hell of a lot of trouble in actually designing covered spaces, public spaces that they could cover and they could work as actual public real. Now, I have a little bit of time to go ahead.
Yes.
How is it produced? What are the important things? Keep in mind that the master plan is not a production of a single discipline. I work in most of my master plans with all of those characters, okay? There were architects, there were building surveyors, property advisors, structural engineers, transport planners, city planners, structural management experts, project management, and so on. Landscape architects, a lot with landscape architects. So, and the master plan can seed in its lead to any of those. For example, in the UK, most of the master plans I did, the private ones, they were actually run by project managers. They were the lead consultant. In some of them, we were as designers. In others, landscape architects were, because the emphasis was on landscape design. So depending where the project sits, then it has a different emphasis. The second thing is, of course, the client, and is always, independently of who pays you, it's a multi-headed client base. In other words, for example, even a simple commercial master plan, the head of planning was actually a client, because unless we could convince him that what we're doing was right, the project wouldn't go ahead. So despite the fact that we were paid by a single person, we had to talk and consider the project manager and the leader of the council, of the local authority, as well as the developer, our client base. Beyond the client base that you see, there is a client base that you don't see. And in the UK, public consultation is compulsory. On every master plan, you need to ask the people who live around it, or what do they think about it. So it's a huge activity around identifying the public and actually running these consultation programs. In Cyprus, it's very weak still, and this is because we don't have collective culture, I think. In other words, we don't have organized groups, and we don't push, and we should be doing that more. Another sort of tricky aspect of drawing a master plan is that what people are telling you what they want, they are describing a brand, and you need to translate that brand into what I call identity. For example, they say, I want a buzzy place. I want a buzzy place, 24 hours, everybody mills and works and plays and goes to pubs and it's till late hours and so on and so forth. So you need to translate that into what you call identity parameters. For example, in order to have 24-hour use, you need to have offices and housing in the same area at the same time. If you want buzz, you need lots of people. So you need to have, you will have high densities. Old people don't buzz in the same way as young people do. So what you need to attract young people. Young people, what they don't have money. So you need to make affordable the area so the young people arrive on the site. So you translate what we call a buzz, a kind of a branding specification into an identity specification. This is always the case in everything that you do, not in master planning. You're always juggling time, quality, and cost. always. That's why you need to understand all of them in order to be able to function. And finally, for this part, I would say that everywhere we generated research projects, every single master plan I did, I would go back to the client and say, can I please have a little bit more money because I need to research this particular issue in order to help your master plan. In this particular case, the Dutch wanted to build a huge platform over 12 lanes of motorway and then have the flexibility to build on top in the future everywhere they liked. When they did the feasibility, that wasn't possible, so they needed to define the places where the blocks of buildings would come and sit, and they asked, how big should the block be in relation to the cost of this platform? And that's what it took. In other words, we drew about 96 models, 8 by 12, I think, and the answer to that is that it has to have the size of a football pitch, 50 by 100. What's a perimeter block of a city that could hold in these high densities absolutely every single use we could think of. We had a list of about 35 uses, and each of these blocks accommodates those. Similar question, when we mix uses, how do we mix them? Do we mix them block by block, like here? Do we mix them street by street, like there? Some streets are residential and some streets are commercial. Or do we mix them building by building? Each one of them implies a completely different urban character. The same here. Somebody was investigating densities. Should it be a density of 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 3.5? What does it mean, and where is the threshold where we become an American city? Another big question that I'm not going to get into it, a lot of these plans, they rely on these codes, design codes, in order to be implemented correctly and make sure that the quality runs through. Because you cannot draw it. You need to write it up in whatever we call code. Couple of slides to finish off. What are the preconditions of success? The master plan goes through this process. Somebody prepares the background information that you need. You design the master plan. You go into implementation of approving the master plan as a statutory plan, as a plan which will go ahead, as planning permits, in other words. And then you break it into bits and you deliver the projects individually. So what the important thing, I think, and what really makes or breaks the delivery of the master plan is this prepare stage. It's actually the setup of a client that you don't know, because when you arrive, already the client has been set up. And some of them, they do their background work and some they don't. So the client needs to write a brief, needs to identify its partners, needs to set up a house team who's going to follow it through, and needs to commission the design team, the process of choosing the design team. But the master planning brief is absolutely essential in order to be able to do that. An example here, you know Old Canary Wharf, I'm sure, in London. Look at the time frames. Battersea Park, it took 40 years to deliver the first stage. This project, equally complex and equally difficult, it took 20. So 20 years shorter, simply because an organization was set up, the London Docklands Development Agency, to oversee having this ectotomic project. So it wasn't delivered by the local authority like Battersea, it was delivered by a company, a public company, which actually took care of all of the things that I mentioned before. We did a research some time back, and this is the last slide, on why does the fast rail system in Europe regenerate some cities, it doesn't regenerate others. And Lille, which sits between Brussels and London, it's one of the case studies we developed. It was a positive case study because Lille became a regional center after the development of this rail line and the new station that Rail Cook has been developed. Everybody we interviewed, it says what it took, it was a charismatic and passionate mayor, a committed project manager, and 3 heart attacks. 3 people actually died during the development of the project. What these projects need, they need strong political backing and political will that usually is carried through the personalities within the master plan. So if you're working in the master planning team, trying to identify the person who is going to be charismatic and committed in order to carry that work through, which is very complex and very challenging. This is all for me, and